I still remember the sound, that horrible mechanical grinding that echoed through our quiet suburban street. At first, I thought someone was doing major landscaping work nearby, until I realized it was coming from my backyard. I dropped my grocery bags right there on the driveway and ran around the side of my house. What I saw? I don't think I'll ever forget it. A small bulldozer was churning through 2 years of my life's work. My wildlife garden, my sanctuary, was being systematically destroyed. Native wildflowers crushed, the small pond I'd carefully constructed, now just a muddy depression. Bird feeders knocked to the ground, and standing there with her arms crossed, looking smugly satisfied, was Karen Sullivan, president of our neighborhood HOA. "We warned you," she said, not even bothering to hide her satisfaction. "This mess was an eyesore. The board voted unanimously." I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. 2 years of research, planting, nurturing, gone in minutes. The monarchs that had just found my milkweed, the family of cardinals that visited every morning, the native bees that had finally established a small colony near my coneflowers. All of it, destroyed because one woman decided my garden was too wild for her suburban aesthetic. When I moved to Oakwood Estates 2 years ago, I was excited to finally have my own piece of land. The neighborhood seemed perfect, good schools nearby, reasonable commute to work, and a backyard that got just the right amount of sun. The HOA guidelines mentioned well-maintained landscapes, but nothing specifically against native gardens. In fact, the community newsletter had even run an article about water conservation and eco-friendly yards right before I moved in. How did we get from that to a bulldozer in my backyard? How did my attempt to create something beautiful and environmentally beneficial turn into this nightmare? I'm still piecing together exactly how things went so wrong, but I need to tell this story, not just for myself, but for anyone who believes that your property should be yours to nurture in a responsible way. This isn't just about plants or HOA overreach. It's about the right to create spaces that give back to our struggling ecosystem, even when they don't fit into someone else's narrow definition of appropriate. Before I tell you how it all came crashing down, let me take you back to how this garden became my passion. Growing up, my grandmother had taught me about gardening, not the manicured, sterile kind you see in magazines, but the kind that works with nature rather than against it. "Everything has a purpose," she used to say as we watched bees pollinate her flowers, even the so-called weeds. Those lessons stayed with me, but apartment living for most of my adult life meant my gardening was limited to a few potted plants on balconies. When I closed on my house at Oakwood Estates, the backyard was what most suburban lots are, a flat expanse of water-hungry grass with a couple of non-native ornamental shrubs planted along the fence line. Perfectly acceptable by conventional standards and completely devoid of life. I spent the first 6 months just observing, tracking sunlight patterns, noting where water collected after rain, researching what plants were native to our region. I joined online forums for wildlife gardeners and even took a certification course in native landscaping offered by our state's conservation department. This wasn't going to be some haphazard project. I wanted to create a sustainable ecosystem that would thrive with minimal intervention. The transformation began in small sections. First, I removed a 10x10 patch of lawn near the back fence and replaced it with native prairie flowers, black-eyed Susans, purple coneflowers, bee balm, and milkweed for the monarchs. I carefully labeled each plant and kept the edges tidy. Nothing too radical, just a cheerful buzzing flower patch that attracted butterflies almost immediately. Encouraged by this success, I expanded gradually. I added a rain garden in the low spot of the yard where water naturally collected, planting it with moisture-loving native species that could help filter runoff before it reached the storm drains. I installed rain barrels to collect water from my gutters. Then came the small pond, about 6 feet across and 18 inches deep at the center, with native aquatic plants and a solar-powered bubbler to keep the water moving. By the end of the first year, nearly half my backyard had been transformed. It wasn't chaotic or messy. I maintained clear pathways made of local stone and kept a 3-foot buffer of conventional lawn around the perimeter. I even installed small, tasteful signs identifying different plant species and explaining their ecological benefits. The garden had structure and intention, just not the rigid, artificial kind that dominates suburban landscapes. The wildlife response was everything I'd hoped for. Hummingbirds became regular visitors. Native bees built nests in the small insect hotel I constructed from natural materials. Frogs found the pond. Birds I'd never seen in the neighborhood, goldfinches, chickadees, even a barred owl one evening, began to appear. I kept a journal documenting each new species, each successful pollination, each small miracle of nature, reclaiming this tiny patch of suburbia. My morning routine became sacred. Coffee in hand, I'd walk the winding paths through my garden, checking on new growth, watching insects go about their business. It was my meditation, my connection to something larger than myself. After stressful days at work, the garden became my therapy. I'd come home, kick off my shoes, and feel the day's tensions melt away as I weeded or watered or simply sat on the small bench near the pond, listening to the chorus of life I'd helped create. Neighbors would occasionally stop by when they saw me working outside. Most were curious rather than critical. The retired biology teacher 2 doors down became a regular visitor, often bringing plant cuttings or spotting bird species I'd missed. A young family across the street would bring their children over to learn about butterflies and tadpoles. Even the mail carrier commented on how the garden had become his favorite stop on the route. "You've created something special here," he told me one hot July day. "My grandfather had a place like this back in the country. Don't see it much in neighborhoods anymore." That was exactly what I'd wanted, to show that even in suburban settings, we could create spaces that honored the natural world instead of erasing it. Little did I know that this vision would soon collide head-on with a very different idea of what a proper backyard should be. The first butterflies had just discovered my milkweed when I also attracted something far less welcome, the attention of our HOA board. I first met Karen Sullivan at the annual neighborhood potluck 3 months after I moved in. She'd introduced herself as the HOA president with the kind of forced smile that never quite reaches the eyes. She'd lived in Oakwood Estates for 15 years and made sure everyone knew she'd been on the board for 12 of them. "We maintain very high standards here," she told me between bites of potato salad. "That's why our property values stay strong. I hope you'll take some time to really study the community guidelines." I assured her I would, and I did. The landscaping section mentioned neatly maintained yards, regular mowing, and approved plant varieties for front yards, but was surprisingly vague about backyards beyond prohibiting visible storage, excessive structures, or anything that could be considered a nuisance. Nothing that specifically prohibited native plants or wildlife gardens. The first note appeared about 8 months after I started my garden project. A formally worded letter expressing concerns about the unkempt appearance of your rear landscape, and reminding me that all landscape modifications require board approval. I was surprised, not only because I'd kept the garden well maintained, but because several neighbors had actually complimented it. I drafted a polite response, explaining the purpose of the garden, its environmental benefits, and noting that I'd maintained a conventional buffer zone specifically to keep peace with neighbors. I included photos showing the garden's organization and enclosed several scientific articles about the benefits of native plant landscapes. I even invited the board members to visit the garden personally so I could address any specific concerns. Karen's response was a lesson in passive-aggressive communication. While your environmental interests are commendable, Oakwood Estates has certain aesthetic standards that all residents agreed to maintain when purchasing property here. Several neighbors have expressed concern about potential pest issues and property value impacts. Several neighbors? I wondered who, considering the positive feedback I'd received. I began paying more attention at neighborhood gatherings, trying to gauge who might have complained. Most interactions remained friendly, but I noticed Karen and a small circle of her friends giving my yard sidelong glances when walking past. One afternoon, I spotted Karen actually taking photos of my backyard from the public path that ran behind our row of houses. Trying to be proactive, I attended the next HOA meeting and asked to briefly address native gardening during the open discussion period. Karen immediately tried to table it for a more appropriate time, but enough board members were curious that I was granted 5 minutes. I prepared thoroughly, creating a simple handout about the benefits of native landscapes: water conservation, pollution reduction, wildlife support, lower maintenance costs. I kept my presentation positive and educational, avoiding any defensiveness. Several residents asked thoughtful questions, and one board member even mentioned that the city had recently started promoting native plant initiatives. Karen, however, was unmoved. "These might be fine for public parks or rural areas," she said dismissively, "but our community has cultivated a specific aesthetic that homeowners rely on. Perhaps you should consider moving to a less developed area if you want to experiment with alternative landscaping." The subtle message was clear: conform or leave. Over the next several months, the letters became more frequent and more specific. Vegetation exceeding 24 inches in height, unauthorized water feature, wildlife attractants creating potential nuisance conditions. Each time, I responded with detailed explanations, references to local ordinances that actually encouraged climate-adaptive landscaping, and reminders that the HOA guidelines had no specific prohibitions against what I was doing. I also began researching HOA law, learning about the limits of their authority, and documented overreach cases. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wanted to be prepared if things escalated. And escalate they did. What began as passive-aggressive notes quickly became something I never imagined would happen in a civilized neighborhood. 6 months into our correspondence war, Karen's approach changed. Rather than sending individual complaint letters, I received an official notice of violation, citing multiple alleged infractions and threatening fines of $100 per day if not corrected within 30 days. The notice listed vague violations like unapproved landscape modifications and creating a nuisance without specifying exactly what needed to change. I scheduled a meeting with the full HOA board, hoping more reasonable voices might prevail. The meeting was set for a Tuesday evening at the community center. I prepared a comprehensive presentation, complete with before and after photos showing the garden's evolution and meticulous maintenance. I brought scientific literature on native gardening benefits and examples of other HOAs that had updated their guidelines to encourage sustainable landscaping. Only 3 of the 7 board members showed up: Karen and 2 of her closest allies on the board. "The others had conflicts," she explained with that same tight smile. "But don't worry, we'll represent their interests." For nearly an hour, I presented my case. I explained how the garden actually increased rather than decreased property values, citing studies showing growing market premiums for eco-friendly homes. I detailed how my garden had been deliberately designed with aesthetics in mind, not simply allowed to grow wild. I showed comparative water usage data from before and after the conversion, demonstrating how my approach conserved a precious resource. Throughout my presentation, Karen checked her phone, whispered to the other board members, and sighed audibly. When I finally finished, she looked up with an expression of manufactured patience. "While we appreciate your enthusiasm," she said, "the fact remains that your backyard has become an eyesore that neighbors have repeatedly complained about. The overgrown plants attract vermin, the standing water breeds mosquitoes, and the overall appearance is inconsistent with community standards." "Which neighbors?" I asked. "I've had several tell me they enjoy the garden, and I'd be happy to address any specific concerns. The water feature has a circulator specifically to prevent mosquito breeding, for instance." "We're not at liberty to disclose who has complained," one of Karen's allies interjected. "Confidentiality is important in these matters." "And what specific changes would bring my yard into compliance?" I pressed. "The guidelines don't actually prohibit native plants or small ponds." Karen's smile tightened further. "The guidelines give the board discretion to determine what constitutes appropriate landscaping, and we've determined that your experiment doesn't meet our standards. I suggest returning the yard to its original condition." In that moment, I realized this wasn't about rules or aesthetics or property values. This was about control, about a small group of people imposing their narrow vision of suburban perfection and resenting anyone who challenged it. I'll need any requirements in writing, I said finally. Specific changes with references to the relevant sections of the HOA covenant they allegedly violate. We'll have our attorney draft something appropriate, Karen replied, ending the meeting. The draft never came. Instead, I received a final warning letter 2 weeks later, threatening legal action if my yard wasn't restored to appropriate condition within 15 days. No specifics, no cited violations. Just an arbitrary deadline and vague threats. I decided it was time to seek legal counsel. A friend recommended an attorney who specialized in property disputes and HOA overreach. After reviewing my documents and photos, she was blunt in her assessment. "They're on shaky ground," she explained. "Your HOA covenant doesn't specifically prohibit native plants or wildlife gardens, and there are state laws limiting HOA restrictions on water conservation landscaping. Plus, they haven't followed proper procedure for enforcement actions." She drafted a firmly worded response citing the relevant laws and requesting proper documentation of specific violations. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Word of the dispute spread through the neighborhood, and people began taking sides. Several neighbors I barely knew stopped by to express support. One brought me a native flowering shrub as a gesture of solidarity. Another, a retired environmental lawyer, offered free consultation. A petition supporting homeowner landscaping rights began circulating. But Karen's faction dug in harder. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes warning about declining property values and health hazards from unregulated landscaping. Someone reported me to the county health department for standing water, though the inspector who visited found no violations and actually complimented the garden's design. The community had become divided over a patch of flowers and a small pond. What should have been a personal choice about how to tend my own backyard had somehow become a neighborhood-defining conflict. I tried one more time to reach a compromise, sending a certified letter proposing several modifications that would address potential concerns while preserving the garden's core purpose. Adding more defined borders, reducing the pond size, removing certain taller plants, and adding more educational signage. I even offered to host an open garden day where neighbors could visit and learn about the benefits of native landscaping. Karen never responded to my proposal. In fact, communication from the HOA board stopped completely. For 2 weeks, there was silence. I hoped it meant they were reconsidering or consulting their attorney about the legal issues my lawyer had raised. I should have known something was wrong when Karen stopped responding to my emails. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found that Tuesday afternoon. That Tuesday began like any other. I left for work at 7:30, spent the day at the office, and stopped by the grocery store on my way home. Nothing suggested it would become the day that would change everything. As I pulled into my driveway around 5:45 p.m., I noticed unusual activity in the neighborhood. A couple of unfamiliar trucks were parked along the street, and there was that mechanical noise coming from behind my house. At first, I thought perhaps a neighbor was having major yard work done. Then I realized the sound was coming from my property. What happened next still feels like a slow-motion nightmare. Dropping my groceries on the driveway, I ran around to the backyard gate. It had been removed from its hinges. Inside my yard was chaos. A small bulldozer was carving through my carefully created garden beds, while 3 men in work clothes were removing my pond liner and tossing plant material into a large dumpster parked on the street. And there was Karen, clipboard in hand, directing the destruction like a conductor leading an orchestra. "What the hell is going on?" I screamed over the bulldozer's engine. The operator noticed me and killed the engine, leading to a sudden, eerie silence, broken only by the sound of cascading dirt. Karen turned, her expression shifting quickly from satisfaction to practiced concern. "Oh, you're home early. We're addressing the covenant violations as voted on by the board. You were given multiple notices. You can't just bulldoze someone's property." My voice was shaking with rage and shock. "This is illegal. Stop this right now." Actually, the HOA covenant gives us the right to remedy violations after proper notification, which you received. The cost will be added to your HOA dues. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this moment. I pulled out my phone and began recording everything. The half-destroyed garden, the workers, Karen's smug face, the equipment. You have no legal right to do this. This is criminal destruction of property, and I'm calling the police right now. Karen's composure slipped slightly. The police won't do anything. This is a civil matter between you and the HOA. But I was already dialing 911, my hands trembling so badly I had to redial. While waiting for an answer, I shouted at the workers, "This is illegal. If you don't leave my property immediately, you'll be named in the lawsuit too." The men looked uncertainly at Karen, who waved dismissively. "They're under contract with the HOA. Your threats are meaningless." When the 911 operator answered, I tried to explain the situation as clearly as my emotions would allow. The operator promised to send officers, but warned it might take 20 to 30 minutes. I hung up and immediately called my attorney, putting her on speaker so Karen could hear. "They're bulldozing my garden right now," I told her, my voice breaking. Karen Sullivan and the HOA sent a crew to destroy everything without any court order or proper notice. My attorney's response was immediate and forceful. "That's absolutely illegal. Tell everyone to leave the property immediately. Take photos and videos of everything. Don't touch anyone, but make it clear they're trespassing. I'm on my way." I repeated her instructions loudly so everyone could hear. Two of the workers looked at each other nervously and began putting down their tools. The third approached Karen and said something I couldn't hear. Karen's face flushed with anger. "You can't stop now. We have a contract." But the damage had been done, literally and figuratively. By the time the police arrived 25 minutes later, the workers had left, but not before destroying nearly 2/3 of my garden. The small pond was now just a muddy hole. My carefully cultivated native flower beds had been churned into dirt. Bird feeders lay crushed on the ground. 2 years of patient cultivation reduced to rubble in less than an hour. The officers took statements from both Karen and me. Karen insisted the HOA had legal authority to remedy violations, producing a copy of the covenant with certain sections highlighted. I showed them the ongoing correspondence, the lack of specific violations cited, and my attorney's letters questioning the HOA's authority. "This appears to be a civil dispute," one officer finally said. "But entering the property and removing or destroying items without a court order could potentially involve criminal charges. I suggest both parties consult their attorneys and resolve this through proper legal channels." After the police left, I stood in my ruined garden as the sun began to set. Where monarch butterflies had once danced among milkweed, there was now just churned mud. The small bench where I'd spent countless peaceful mornings lay splintered under tread marks. A family of goldfinches that had nested nearby circled in apparent confusion, their habitat suddenly gone. I fell to my knees in the middle of the destruction and did something I hadn't done in years. I sobbed. Not just for the plants and the wildlife, but for the violation. My space, my small effort to create something beautiful and meaningful, had been deliberately destroyed by someone who couldn't tolerate anything that didn't fit her narrow vision of what was acceptable. A neighbor from across the street, an elderly man who had often stopped to admire the garden, came over with a bottle of water and a gentle hand on my shoulder. "This isn't right," he said simply. "And you're not alone here." As the dust settled on what remained of my garden, I knew I couldn't let this stand. Not just for me, but for everyone's right to create sustainable spaces. The morning after the destruction, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. For a moment, I hoped it had all been a nightmare, until I looked out my bedroom window at the muddy wasteland that had once been my sanctuary. My attorney arrived early, walking the property with me and documenting everything with photos and detailed notes. "This is one of the most egregious HOA overreaches I've seen," she said, shaking her head. "They had no court order with no explicit violation of a specific covenant provision, and no emergency situation that would justify this kind of action. We have multiple grounds for a serious legal case." We spent hours developing a strategy. First, we filed an emergency injunction to prevent any further destruction or modification of my property by the HOA. Next, we prepared a comprehensive damages claim, including not just the financial cost of plants and materials, but also the labor value, emotional distress, and punitive damages for the willful nature of the destruction. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood and beyond. By mid-morning, several neighbors had stopped by to express their shock and support. By afternoon, local news vans were parked on the street. A reporter from the city newspaper asked for an interview, which my attorney advised me to give, with her present to ensure I didn't say anything that could compromise our legal position. "This isn't just about my garden," I told the reporter. "It's about whether a small group of people should have the power to dictate how homeowners use their private property, especially when they're making environmentally responsible choices." The story ran the next day, complete with before and after photos that captured the devastating transformation. Online, the article generated hundreds of comments, overwhelmingly supportive of my position. By the end of the week, 3 local environmental organizations had reached out offering support, including a native plant society that volunteered plants and expertise for eventual restoration. Karen and the HOA board remained conspicuously silent publicly, though my attorney received a letter from their lawyer claiming the action was justified under covenant provisions and suggesting a small settlement to avoid protracted litigation. The offer, $2,500 for landscape restoration to approved standards, was insultingly low and came with strings attached, including my agreement to follow strict HOA-approved landscaping guidelines going forward. "They're not taking this seriously yet," my attorney observed, "but they will." Meanwhile, I discovered something interesting: a deep divide within the HOA board itself. 2 board members contacted me privately, claiming they had never approved the destruction and that Karen had acted without proper board authorization. According to them, Karen had presented my case as resolved at the last board meeting, claiming I had agreed to modify the garden voluntarily. When that didn't happen, she apparently took matters into her own hands, using the HOA's maintenance contractor under the guise of an emergency landscape remediation. I asked these board members to provide written statements, which they initially hesitated to do, fearing Karen's influence in the neighborhood. But as public opinion continued to shift dramatically in my favor, they eventually agreed. Their testimonies would prove crucial in what came next. 3 weeks after the incident, we filed our lawsuit. It named not just the HOA as an entity, but Karen Sullivan personally, the landscape contractor who performed the destruction, and 2 other board members who had explicitly supported Karen's actions. The suit alleged multiple causes of action: trespass, conversion of property, breach of fiduciary duty, violation of state environmental protection statutes, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The day after filing, I received an unexpected visitor, Lisa Chen, a member of the city council who had championed a recent urban biodiversity initiative. She had read about my case and wanted to see the damage firsthand. "This is precisely why we need stronger protections for natural landscaping," she said after touring what remained of my garden. "HOAs shouldn't have the power to override ecologically beneficial practices, especially as we face climate change and biodiversity loss." She promised to look into citywide ordinances that would explicitly protect homeowners' rights to implement native landscapes and wildlife habitats. As the legal process began grinding forward, I started the painful process of assessing what could be salvaged. A botanist friend helped me identify surviving root systems and collect seeds from crushed plants that might be viable. We carefully removed debris, saving what could be reused, and documenting everything for the lawsuit. The emotional toll was immense. Every day, I'd look out at the destroyed space and feel waves of grief and anger wash over me. The wildlife that had called my garden home had largely disappeared. The transformation from vibrant ecosystem to barren dirt was a constant reminder of how fragile our efforts to nurture nature can be when faced with entrenched resistance. But something else was happening too. Neighbors I barely knew brought plants from their own gardens to help start the healing process. A local landscaper offered pro bono design services for the eventual restoration. An environmental law professor from the state university asked if she could use my case in her course on property rights and conservation. What had begun as a personal tragedy was catalyzing a community conversation about sustainability, property rights, and the purpose of shared governance. Karen, meanwhile, was experiencing the opposite trajectory. As details of her unilateral action emerged, neighbors began avoiding her. Two long-standing board members resigned, publicly citing disagreement with the handling of my case. The HOA's insurance company launched its own investigation, concerned about liability exposure. Karen's social standing, something she had clearly valued deeply, was eroding rapidly. What began as a garden dispute was about to test the very limits of HOA authority versus homeowner rights. The legal process moved forward with excruciating slowness. Depositions, discovery requests, motions and countermotions. Each step required reliving the destruction while facing Karen and her supporters across conference tables and courtrooms. 4 months in, we had our first significant victory. The judge denied the HOA's motion to dismiss, ruling that our claims had sufficient merit to proceed to trial. More importantly, he granted our request to depose all HOA board members individually, including those who had been absent from key meetings. These depositions revealed a pattern of procedural violations that went far beyond my case. Board meetings held without proper notice, decisions made without quorum, selective enforcement of covenant provisions against certain homeowners, while others, particularly friends of board members, received exemptions. Financial records showing questionable expenditures approved without full board review. My attorney added these findings to our case, strengthening our claims of breach of fiduciary duty and demonstrating a pattern of arbitrary governance that undermined the HOA's defense. Meanwhile, Karen's position as HOA president had become untenable. At an emergency association meeting called by concerned homeowners, she faced direct questioning about her actions. Her typical composure cracked under pressure, revealing the rigid ideology behind her decisions. "Property values are everything in a community like this," she snapped when a resident asked why native gardens were considered problematic. "People don't pay premium prices to live next to wildlife habitats. They want proper landscaping that shows pride of ownership." When another resident pointed out that young homebuyers were increasingly prioritizing eco-friendly features, Karen dismissed them as temporary trends that wouldn't last. "I've maintained these standards for 15 years, she declared, and our property values have only increased. The meeting ended with a vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership and the election of an interim board that included several residents who had supported my right to natural landscaping. The new board immediately opened settlement discussions, recognizing the severe legal exposure created by Karen's actions. Our settlement negotiations were complex. I wasn't interested in just financial compensation, though that was certainly part of it. I wanted structural change that would protect other homeowners from similar overreach and explicitly recognize the value of ecological landscaping. After several rounds of negotiation, we reached an agreement that included substantial financial compensation covering the full cost of garden restoration, emotional distress damages, and all legal fees, a formal apology from the HOA acknowledging the improper destruction of my garden, revision of the HOA covenant to explicitly permit native plant landscaping and wildlife-friendly features with specific guidelines developed in consultation with local environmental experts, creation of a homeowner dispute resolution process requiring mediation before any enforcement action, annual training for all board members on HOA governance, legal limitations, and environmental best practices. Karen refused to sign the settlement, maintaining to the end that she had acted within her authority. But with the majority of board members supporting the agreement and the HOA's insurance company threatening to deny coverage if the case went to trial, she was effectively overruled. The day we finalized the settlement was bittersweet. The legal victory couldn't undo the destruction or restore the mature ecosystem that had been wiped out, but it did establish an important precedent, not just for our community, but potentially for others facing similar conflicts. As part of the public statement accompanying the settlement, the new HOA president acknowledged something important. Our community guidelines should reflect evolving understanding of environmental stewardship while respecting homeowners' reasonable use of their property. We regret the actions taken against a garden that ultimately supported values we all share: sustainability, biodiversity, and responsible resource management. Local media covered the settlement extensively, and several regional HOAs reached out to request copies of our revised guidelines as models for their own communities. The City Council accelerated work on an ordinance protecting natural landscaping rights, with Councilmember Chen citing my case as a catalyst for needed reform. Karen put her house on the market a month after the settlement was finalized. The real estate listing emphasized the property's traditional landscaping and made no mention of the community's new openness to native gardening. She moved away before the restoration of my garden was complete, never acknowledging the pain her actions had caused or the positive changes that ultimately resulted. The victory wasn't just about compensation, it was about the chance to rebuild something even better, with the community now watching and learning. Rebuilding began in early spring, almost exactly a year after the destruction. The timing felt right, a season of renewal after a long winter of legal battles and emotional recovery. I approached the restoration with a different perspective than my original garden. This wouldn't just be my private project anymore. It had become something the community was invested in. I worked with a local landscape architect who specialized in native plantings to create a design that would be both ecologically valuable and visually accessible to neighbors who might still be unfamiliar with natural landscaping aesthetics. The new design incorporated more defined pathways and borders, creating a sense of intention that even traditional gardeners could appreciate. We installed educational signage explaining the environmental benefits of each garden zone. A new pond, slightly smaller than the original but deeper in the center, included a decorative fountain that eliminated any concerns about standing water while providing necessary aeration. What surprised me most was the community involvement. The Native Plant Society organized a planting day that brought 30 volunteers to help install the foundation species. Neighbors contributed plants divided from their own gardens. A local scout troop built and installed bird and bat houses along the rear fence line. The retired biology teacher who had supported my original garden offered to lead monthly nature walks for interested residents, showing how the ecosystem was developing and identifying the wildlife it attracted. Even more surprising were the gradual conversions happening throughout the neighborhood. The family across the street replaced a corner of their lawn with a butterfly garden inspired by my original design. An elderly couple, 2 doors down, installed rain barrels after seeing how effectively mine captured water for garden use. Small patches of native plants began appearing in yards that had once been pristine monocultures of turf grass. The new HOA board embraced this evolution. They created a Sustainable Landscape of the Season award to recognize innovative, eco-friendly yard designs. They organized workshops on water conservation and pollinator support, and they formally partnered with the city's biodiversity initiative, making our community one of the first HOA neighborhoods to be designated a wildlife-friendly zone. 6 months after the replanting, the first monarchs returned, drawn to the new milkweed patch that had been explicitly included in the restoration plan. Seeing their orange wings fluttering among the green shoots felt like a symbolic healing, nature's resilience mirroring my own recovery from the trauma of destruction. Karen's former allies on the board had either resigned or moderated their positions, recognizing which way the cultural winds were blowing. Property values, contrary to dire predictions, continued to rise, with real estate agents now highlighting the community's environmental initiatives as a selling point for younger buyers concerned about sustainability. The legal settlement had included a provision allowing me to document the garden's restoration for educational purposes. I created a blog chronicling the regrowth, sharing seasonal photos and observations about returning wildlife. What began as personal therapy became an unexpected resource for others facing HOA restrictions on natural landscaping, with readers from across the country reaching out for advice on navigating their own challenges. A year and a half after the bulldozer had torn through my garden, Councilmember Chen invited me to speak at the signing ceremony for the city's new Natural Landscape Protection Ordinance. The legislation explicitly protected homeowners' rights to install native plant gardens, rain gardens, and wildlife habitats, limiting HOA restrictions to reasonable size and maintenance requirements rather than plant species or design philosophy. Sometimes positive change comes from painful conflicts, Chen said at the ceremony. This ordinance might have taken years longer without a clear example of why it was needed. Standing at the podium, looking out at the diverse group of supporters, environmental activists, property rights advocates, gardening enthusiasts, and even several of my formerly skeptical neighbors, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. What happened to my garden was devastating, I told the audience. But what grew from that destruction was something larger and more important than what was lost. We've created not just protection for natural landscapes, but a new understanding of how our individual choices about the spaces we tend can collectively shape the future of our environment. Later that evening, I sat on the new bench beside my restored pond, watching dragonflies dart across the water's surface and listening to the chorus of frogs that had colonized the aquatic plants. The garden wasn't the same as before. It couldn't be. But in many ways, it had become something more meaningful. A testament to resilience, a symbol of changing values, and a small but vibrant example of how we might better balance human community with the natural world that sustains us. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the native grasses that swayed gently in the evening breeze. In that moment, I felt a profound sense of peace, not because everything had been restored exactly as it was, but because something had been transformed. What began as a personal garden had become a catalyst for community change. Karen's bulldozer had destroyed my plants, but it had also broken open a conversation that needed to happen about our relationship with nature, about the purpose of community governance, about the balance between individual expression and collective standards. I sometimes wonder if Karen ever realizes what her actions ultimately accomplished. Her attempt to enforce a rigid vision of suburban perfection had instead accelerated a shift toward environmental consciousness that might have taken years to evolve naturally. In trying to uphold what she saw as traditional neighborhood values, she had inadvertently helped create new ones better suited to a changing world. The challenges aren't over, of course. There will always be tension between different visions of how we should live in community with each other and with the natural world. But now, at least in this small corner of suburbia, that conversation includes the voices of butterflies and bees, native plants, and flowing water. Voices that had been systematically excluded from our landscape choices for too long. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above my rejuvenated garden, I made a silent promise to the space and to myself to remain vigilant in protecting what we'd created, to continue sharing the story of destruction and rebirth, and to never underestimate the power of even a small patch of earth to change human hearts and minds. Sometimes it takes a bulldozer to clear the ground for new growth, not just of plants, but of ideas. And in the end, perhaps that's what this journey has been about. The recognition that true community flourishing requires diversity, resilience, and the courage to challenge harmful conventions, even when they come wrapped in the seemingly benign package of the way things have always been done. My wildlife garden stands today as living proof that another way is possible, a way that honors both human community and the more than human world that makes our existence possible. And that ultimately is a victory worth every moment of struggle it took to achieve it.